Hi, Founder fans. Jason here with Michael Troy of the American Revolution podcast. And today we are going to be talking about the top four major generals in the Continental Army, following up on our previous discussion where we kind of went through all the generals real quick. Michael, of course, thank you for coming back.
Sure, happy to be here.
So, the Continental Army is established in Philadelphia. They give George Washington his little thumbs up, and they need to start picking major generals to, well, general. And the first guy on the list is our friend Artemas Ward.
Right, this is June of 1775. The Second Continental Congress just basically came in May, uh, right on the heels of Lexington and Concord, which happened in April. So they were really playing catch up at this point, trying to figure out what to do. And the first thing they decided to do is, well, we need to create an army. And you've got the New England Army, which is kind of just thrown together literally during the Battle of Lexington and Concord. You just have all these militiamen coming out and shooting at the British kind of willy nilly, very, disorganized, kind of a mess. And then they just surround Boston when the British retreat back into Boston and they start besieging the city. And that's kind of where things are when Congress decides they need to create an army. So they're basically creating an entire Continental Army to replace what's there then and kind of take charge of the fighting that's going on. As you say, they appoint George Washington to be the commander in chief because they decided they wanted somebody who was not a New Englander, and George looked pretty good in his uniform, so why not give him a shot, see what happens. And then they have to pick four major generals, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And the first one is the guy, Artemas Ward, who was the commander of the New England Army that was surrounding Boston when they decided to replace him with George Washington. He gets the become the second in command. Um, Artemas Ward, as I said, was from Massachusetts. He ran a general store during the colonial era, um, but he did also hold some government positions. He was like a justice of the peace and a member of the Colonial Assembly, things like that. And because of his position of political prominence, he held some. Um, he was an officer in the militia, and he fought in the French and Indian War, but fighting is I'm using the term loosely. He served in the French and Indian War, but he really didn't do a lot of fighting. His unit just kind of served on the western frontier of Massachusetts in garrison duty. So he really didn't have a whole lot of combat experience when the American Revolution began. He was um, as I said, he was a politician, so he had a lot of political connections, which I think is why he kept getting promoted within the militia. And he was actually the commander of the Massachusetts militia by 1775. Um, and he was an outspoken opponent of British taxes and British policies. He had actually gotten kicked out of the Colonial Assembly by Governor Bernard at one point because he was
Yeah,
one source I read said he was only second to James Otis in his criticism of British taxes.
it's funny. I'm
So
very glad you brought that up because that was the one thing about Ward I definitely want to get across is when we look back at Artemas Ward, we generally say, "Hey, this guy was one of the top generals in the Continental Army. He was a soldier," but no, it's often overlooked how outspoken he was in the Colonial Assembly itself, to the point where, as you said, he gets himself kicked out for being such a little rebel there.
right, and it's really his politics and political leadership that leads to his position within the military rather than any real military experience. But he was one of the main Massachusetts rabble rousers, shall we say, one of the big political opponents of British taxes and British policies and all that.
Right. And then when the Continental Congress starts choosing major generals, he seems to be the natural choice because he's in charge of Massachusetts militia, and then the Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Hampshire militias all come to Massachusetts for a bit, and they kind of agree. It's not that they're under his command, but there's like seems to be an unspoken agreement where it's like, all right, we're in Massachusetts, let's let them take the lead, so to speak.
Well, yeah, Connecticut and New Hampshire actually agreed to let um, Ward be in command of their troops. There was some debate about whether other Massachusetts officers, generals, and colonels could give orders to people from Connecticut and New Hampshire, places like that. But they did kind of entrust Ward to set overall policy for all of the armies that were there at the time. So yeah, that was the big thing. It's a question I've never really been able to answer. Was what was Ward's reaction when he got kicked out of the top seat and got put in as Washington's second in command? He certainly didn't pout about it or say anything. He wasn't outspoken in the way a lot of generals were when they got demoted, shall we say, in the Continental Army. He seemed to be a good soldier and kind of go along with it, but he also didn't seem to really work very closely with Washington either, or the two men really never developed a bond or a relationship.
That's a good question. I don't have an answer. I can speculate. I have two things I would speculate. First of all, as now is becoming more famous than it used to be, Dr. Joseph Warren was really running the show, and there is an argument to be made. I'm not necessarily making it, but people have made it to me that Ward was already number two to Warren when it came to the whole overall project, and therefore he was accustomed to, perhaps I'll say, he was a little accustomed to being number two. Um, and
Well, yeah,
additionally, I would also note that, as you said, he was a great politician, and he probably saw that this was an opportunity to not make waves for his own political future.
that could be. He was in command over Warren. Warren, it was kind of one of those weird positions where Warren was in a higher political position than Ward, but Ward was outranked Warren within the army. Um, Ward did not really do much in the way of strategy or tactics or really much of anything. The siege of Boston, they mostly just sat there. What Ward was doing with most of his time was logistics. He was looking for food, he was looking for ammunition, he was looking for other things. And he really left the confrontations with the British up to General Warren and to another general, Israel Putnam, who we're going to get to in a few minutes. But those were the two men who really kind of led the soldiers, um, decided where men were going to be deployed and whether they were going to fight, and kind of were encouraging the men, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, despite his reaction, which again I was speculating, we are not sure, as you said, but despite his reaction, he clearly seems to have been the perfect, probably easiest choice for the Continental Army because of the things we've listed. Already leading the show in the area, and you know he might not have been leading men like those other two gentlemen, but running supplies is a humongous part of fighting a war. So, having the lay of the land of not just Massachusetts but New England in general, certainly makes him a clear winner. Now, I did we want to go through all four gentlemen today, but we should note a little bit about do a little overview of their whole career if we can. Um, so
Yeah.
go ahead.
Well, he didn't do a whole lot. As I said, before the war, he was involved in the tax protests, and he was kind of a minor public official. He actually resigned his commission in 1777, supposedly for health reasons, although he seemed to have a long and active life after that. He continued. He was actually serving as a justice while he was still a general in the Continental Army, so he was kind of doing two jobs at the same time there. When the main army moved on to New York after the British left Boston, and Washington went down to New York, he kind of left Ward in command of what was called the Eastern Army, the Army of New England, which at that time really became pretty meaningless because not much happened in New England after that time. But yeah, Ward never really left New England. He stayed in there, as I said, until 1777 when he resigned for health reasons. But then he went on to become uh, I think he was president of the Supreme Executive Council of Massachusetts, basically their version of a governor at the time. And I think he was Speaker of the State House for a time as well. So he held a number of very important political positions during the war. And
Well, we should note though, he was in charge of the Eastern Department, and although the Eastern Department, which is basically New England, would have very little action for the remainder of the war, they didn't necessarily know that in 1776 when they went to New York. You know, to be fair, uh, uh, he does resign fairly quickly after that. But it is may not have been the most action-packed position, but it certainly was an esteemed one.
oh no, it was an important position, although it didn't see any combat. Uh, there was a big job in recruiting New Englanders to go fight in other parts of the country, raising food and resources and supplies for the army, that sort of thing. And as I said, even when he left the army, he was involved in a lot of the political things. He went and served in the Continental Congress, and he was even elected to the U.S. House of Representatives once the Constitution was implemented.
Well, I did want to note that, as you said, he resigns for sickness, but then 12 years later, he is an inaugural member of the United States House of Representatives. One of those, uh, I don't want to use the term sacred few, but one of those handful of fortunate gentlemen to start the engine of the United States government.
Yeah, he served 2 terms in the House, and I think that's when he finally called it quits. And yeah, he finally passed away in 1800.
Yeah. So that's General Artemas Ward, number two Major General for a bit. um, After that, we move over to everyone's favorite, Major General Charles Lee. Now, we did brief, we went through the list last week. We have briefed through Charles Lee in the past, but he has quite a major role in the entirety of the American Revolution. Um,
Yeah, Lee was an interesting pick, and he was very different from many of the generals we see because, of course, most Americans didn't have a lot of military experience. They mostly had served in the militia. They were people like Ward who were mostly politicians and held day jobs doing other things. Um, they were not career officers. They were not really experienced in leading men into battle. And you could say the same even of George Washington. George Washington really didn't have a whole lot of military experience. I mean, we all know he, started the French and Indian War, and then he was involved in the campaign to take Pittsburgh. But even there, he was not a commander. He was not really leading troops. So we didn't really have a lot of leaders, military leaders of men to command the upper echelons of the Continental Army. Now, Charles Lee was just such a man. He served in the regular army. He was born in England. He was an English officer. I believe his father was a major general. No, or am I thinking of somebody else now? I just did background on all these people.
yeah,
I'm
we
gonna
could
get
check
them
on that.
mixed
Yeah,
up.
we don't have all of the family histories memorized to the viewers.
I,
His
um,
father was definitely someone in one of the wars,
but
or in
yeah,
the British
but
Army. He
he
was definitely something in either the Navy or the Army.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. His father was a major general. I'm looking at my notes now. And yeah, he joined his father's regiment at the age of 15. So he really had literally spent his whole life in the regular army fighting in combat. And yeah, he came over to America with General Braddock, fought in the Battle of the Monongahela, which really started the French and Indian War. He was there with General Washington and with General Gates and a whole bunch of other people that went on to bigger things during the war. Um, he fought in Canada, was part of the attack on Fort Ticonderoga that went so badly for the British. Uh, he did, and he was actually wounded in that battle. So yeah, he had fought in a number of places. And then after the war ended in America, he went on to go fight in Europe while the 7 Years' War was still continuing. He went over to Portugal, which was an ally of Britain at the time, fighting against the Spanish. And he actually distinguished himself in battle and got quite a reputation over there while serving under another British general by the name of Johnny Burgoyne. Um, so yeah, he and then after the war ended, he um, he went to work for Poland, I think. Yeah, he was aide de camp to Stanislaus in Poland, and then went and fought in the Russo-Turkish War. So he was just going from war to war, bouncing around, getting more and more experience.
Right. He learned all
Uh,
sorts of types of warfare, though, especially fighting over
right,
in Eastern Europe.
right. So he had had a lot of experience fighting in American wars, doing Indian-style warfare. I should mention during the French and Indian War, he actually married an Iroquois squaw and had two children with her. So he was very, involved in Indian relations, I guess you could call it. Uh, you know,
But
so so yeah, he had the experience in America with Indian fighting, and he had the experience with European style warfare. So he was kind of an all around expert. Um, and everybody kind of considered him as such, including Washington, who thought that, he was a valuable addition to make up for even some of Washington's own shortcomings in that area in terms of experience.
now Lee had only
Uh,
lived in the future United States in North America for a handful of years when the war breaks out.
yeah, Lee, I'm not sure exactly what happened, but he kind of had a falling out with the British Army. It may have been that he kind of saw his um, chances of promotion being greatly diminished in the peace years. And he kind of hung it up, sold his commission, which you could sell for a few £1,000s at the time, which was quite a bit of money. And he used that to come over to America, and he was going to buy land and become a gentleman farmer. So he came over in 1773 and kind of wandered around North America for the next couple of years. He really didn't settle down and buy anything, but was in fact visiting various parts of the colonies and kind of getting himself known and getting to know some of the other people. He was very outspoken about uh, opposition to British policies in America and all that. So he was kind of setting himself up to be, an experienced leader who was an opponent of British policies. In 1775, he finally did settle down and buy a farm in Virginia. It's actually in an area that's today part of West Virginia, so it was out kind of in the west near his old comrade in arms, Horatio Gates, who also had a farm out there. And he was only there really for a few months when he got called up to go serve in the Continental Army.
Yeah, almost right away. So it's interesting because we know the Continental Congress was very attached to getting different generals from different colonies, but you see, Washington and then the number three guy essentially in Lee are both from Virginia, but really from what we're talking about here, it sounds like Lee really wasn't from anywhere at that point. He was more of a
Well,
hired gun.
Lee wasn't representing Virginia, and you're right. Most of the generals were picked because of political reasons, either because of their positions in politics or because they came from a state that Congress wanted to get more involved in the war, and they wanted to kind of spread out the generalships between the various states. Lee, I think, was really just picked because he was the man with military experience, and he was going to carry all these, other pseudo civilian generals through the war with his vast array of military experience.
Right. Go tell Washington what to do,
It's
Mike.
actually it's actually funny. Lee was visiting George Washington at Mount Vernon when word came that Lexington and Concord had been attacked and that they were being called to the Continental Congress for chances of picking an army. So they were, you know, kind of both thinking that they were up for the top position. I think Lee was thinking he might be called to be the commander because, let's face it, he was the most military experienced man. So both of them like headed straight for Philadelphia, thinking that they were going to get the number one job.
Did they ride together?
I don't think so,
Oh,
no.
well, that would have been too good. That's
But
interesting.
Washington had a lot of respect for Lee as a general and as a military officer, and for his experience. He really, relied on Lee and thought that Lee was the man to have.
Yeah, well, it sounds like pretty much everyone did.
Yeah, I think both sides kind of thought Lee was the most important officer in the Continental Army. Certainly, Lee thought that. He had a very
It sounds
uh,
like every officer of the
highly
Continental Army thought they were the most important officer, except for George Washington.
that may be. So I guess some were better at hiding it than others, but yeah. Um, so yeah, Lee becomes the number three man, and he effectively becomes the number two man after they leave Boston because they really do kind of shunt Artemas Ward aside, and he's off kind of doing his own thing, and Washington's not really consulting him with anything, and he's really relying on Lee to be his, main supporting general, and he sends Lee down to South Carolina, where the British. This is actually a hilarious story. Lee is on his way south because they think the British are going to attack south somewhere. This is like late 1775, where there's kind of a war, but it's not really a whole war yet. No one's really sure where this is going. And he goes down to New York, where the British are sitting in New York Harbor because the Patriots have kind of kicked them out of the city, but they haven't really left yet. They're just kind of hanging out there. And he goes to stop in and see some of his old buddies, and he goes aboard ship and hangs out with Henry Clinton, and asks him what he's up to these days. And Clinton says, "Yeah, we're going to go down to Charleston Harbor and take over the fort down there." Like he just tells the enemy his plans, what they're going to go do, knowing full well that Lee is a general in the Continental Army. But yeah, you're my
Yeah.
enemy, but you're my old buddy, so I'll tell you, we're just going to go down there and take Fort Sullivan and Charleston Harbor. So he tells them this, and Lee's like, "Okay." So Lee heads down to Charleston Harbor and starts setting up the defenses
Yeah,
there,
it's crazy.
and it's insane. Yeah, and
Although Lee gets a little bit questionable as a character in this story. So, how crazy was it?
yeah, well, yeah, we'll turn the tables on that in another year or two, which I'll get to in a second. But yeah, Lee goes down to defend Charleston Harbor, and as much as he thinks of himself, he thinks very little of the Continental Army and everybody else in it. He thinks that these guys are incompetent. They'll never stand up to British regulars. They're just going to get their butts kicked. And he tells the Americans to abandon Sullivan's Island and Fort Sullivan and just get the heck off the island because they're all going to be captured. And the American who's on the island in command, General Moultrie, I think he's actually Colonel Moultrie at the time, says, "No, no, we're not going anywhere. We're going to stay and fight." He's like, "Yeah, fine, you're all going to get killed. You're all going to be killed or captured. You're idiots." And of course, they do manage to defend the fort and chase off the British. So Lee actually gets credit for the victory because he's the overall commander, but they won because they basically disobeyed his orders, or I guess they weren't orders, they were so much as suggestions, but they disobeyed what he thought they should do
Was Moultrie in the
to do
Continental Army, or was he South Carolina militia?
at the time. I think he was in the militia at that
Yeah,
point.
so
He
that would have been a little
joined the
bit murky whether or not. I know at large the militias generally defaulted to Washington to show a unifying force, but militias within their own state, technically, at this point, it hadn't really been determined. So technically, as you said, it was more of suggestions than commands, because it seems like at this point
Oh,
it hadn't been quite ironed out yet who exactly was running the show.
generally speaking, it wasn't, but in this case, the governor of South Carolina agreed that Lee should take command of all military forces in South Carolina. So he had the stamp of approval from the civilian government, which for the Southern governors, after this point, it was almost impossible to get them to give any command to anyone. But they did give it to Lee at this time, and Lee did get credit for the win there. So
Right.
for whatever reason, it really enhanced his stature. And the next thing he did was he got recalled back to New York because this was, Clinton was trying to do this quick capture and then get back up to New York to and be part of General Howe's overall invasion of New York. Lee goes back up there just as the British are kind of taking Long Island and getting ready, moving into Manhattan. And Lee takes one look and says, "Yeah, you guys got to get out of here. You got to retreat. You're idiots for staying here this long." Um, which he was absolutely right. I mean, if the British had done what General Clinton had suggested and landed troops to the north of the Continental Army on Manhattan Island and kind of trapped them on the island with the Navy to the south and the Army to the north, war could have been over right then.
Yeah.
It's only because General Howe decided to invade the island in the most idiotic and slow way possible that he gave the Americans time to escape. But Lee saw it as a trap and he told them to get out of there. And so Lee basically saved the army. So that's the positive way of looking at it. The negative way of looking at it is Lee's had two commands so far, and the only thing he suggested is run away.
Well, with this type of army, it's not necessarily the worst recommendation. Uh,
Right, it's not entirely bad advice, but it does
yeah.
show, I think, that Lee did not have much respect for the idea that the Americans could stand and fight against the British.
It's a pre-Steuben army, so retreat was definitely a good idea at any point. Yeah, so this happens, New York happens, and then eventually Lee serves through a gigantic portion of the war. I don't want to get my time frames mixed up, but he is shortly thereafter captured.
Right. Well, when the Americans get kicked out of New York, Lee takes a big portion of the army and moves kind of further up the Hudson River. And Washington takes about 5,000 men and is trying to move them over into New Jersey. Now, about 60% of his force was still in Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, and Washington had ordered that those men retreat and pull over to New Jersey. Nathaniel Greene says, "No, I think we can defend the fort. Let's stay and see what happens." And of course, the British capture all 3,000 men. So Washington is now left with a force of 2,000 men in New Jersey and facing the entire British army of 40,000 across the river in New York. And so his first thought is, General Lee, could you please come down and give me a hand here? We've got this huge army about to attack me, and I'm, retreating across New Jersey. I'm going to need you guys to stand and fight. And Lee's like, yeah, no thanks. I'm just going to hang out here and watch you get your butt kicked, and then I'll come in and become the leader after you get captured, George. At least that's my opinion of what he was thinking at the
It's
time.
yeah, that's
Obviously
definitely
didn't say that.
paraphrasing.
Yeah, I mean, Lee was basically saying, "Oh, we can't make it. My men don't have shoes. We can't march. We have all these problems. We'll get there as soon as we can." That's kind of the stuff he's telling Washington, and at the same time, he's also telling pretty much every other officer in the army, Washington's not up to snuff. He needs to be replaced. This has got to, we've got to do something about this. And this is actually, there's a famous thing where Washington's own aide, Joseph Reed, writes a letter to um, General Lee, basically agreeing with Lee that, yeah, maybe we should replace Washington with somebody else. Lee replies, Washington gets the letter thinking it's, information about when Lee's going to get here and help me with my army. So he, even though it's addressed to Reed, he opens up and reads it and realizes that his own aide is like saying, yeah, Lee should replace Washington as the head of the army, and becomes a whole thing.
Well,
So anyway, Lee's up in upstate New York, very, very, very slowly bringing his army down towards George Washington. And he's in North Jersey. His army's camped at one night, and Lee decides he's going to get a good night's sleep at a tavern that's about 10 or 20 miles from where his army's camped. Of course, everybody in the neighborhood hears that General Lee is sleeping in this tavern, including the local Tories. They tell a British patrol under the command of Bannister Tarleton, and Tarleton runs over to the inn and captures General Lee, and Lee is now a prisoner of war.
and just to again put some perspective on this, we're only a little more than a year. We're about a year and a half into the war, and
Yeah,
he's
this is
already
late
talking
17th.
trash about Washington. I mean, Washington probably shouldn't have committed mail fraud there, but you already see these high-ranking generals casting doubt onto Washington's abilities, and now, for whatever reason, Lee is, as you said, like 10 miles from his army, and like taking a nap, and just up and gets captured.
Yeah, and a lot of people on both sides of the war thought that this was the end of the war, that this was it. I mean, Lee was really the Americans' only chance of success, and with him captured, the Americans have no credible officer that can even lead the army
Can I
at this
ask you
point.
though? So at this point, Lee actually has a bigger number of soldiers in his army than Washington has. Um,
Yeah, Lee has about 4 or 5 thousand, I
but
think.
but that army is able to make it to Washington because Lee wasn't
Right.
with them when he got captured.
Lee being captured was really the best thing that ever happened to Washington because even though Washington thought it was a disaster at the time, he kind of agreed that Lee was important to the cause. But it was really the best thing that happened because Lee, who was unable to get his army to move more than like a couple miles a day because of all the troubles they were having, as soon as he got captured, his second in command ran the army right down to George Washington in a matter of a day or two. And they joined up, and Washington finally had a large enough army to do something. By this time, it was December 1776. Washington retreated across to Pennsylvania. The British decided to call it a winter and left a couple of Hessian regiments in places like Trenton. And Washington finally had this combined army and was able to cross the river and um, put thoughts of complete continental defeat to rest by the victories at Trenton and Princeton.
I'm having a little bit of a memory blank, but do you recall who the number two Lee's number two was? I know I just wrote about him recently. Oh man, it's really gonna bother me. Never mind.
Yeah, I can't
uh,
remember who it was.
it's in my head. Like I know I just wrote an article about him. I know he's in there. And now I feel really guilty for the founder of the day from last week, whose name I don't remember. Um, Carrying on. So Lee gets captured, and now he's held in New York, and he's once again chit chatting with Horatio Gates. Uh, and he does some, we'll say, shady things in these conversations. Is that
Uh,
generous?
you mean with Richard Howe, or
Richard
not
Howe.
Richard
I'm
Howe?
sorry. Did
William
I
Howe.
say
William Howe.
Horatio Gates? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Yes, General Howe,
Um,
who he had just spoken with about South Carolina about a year before, less than a year before this.
right. Well, Lee gets really worried when he's first captured because they put him in chains. They're not treating him like a an honored prisoner of war or anything. They treat him like a common criminal. He writes a letter to General Howe about his conditions. It gets returned unopened to Lieutenant Colonel Lee, which is his rank in the Army.
Oh, that's
And
nice.
Lee gets really worried that they're basically cons- very seriously thinking that they should treat Lee as a traitor and a deserter to the British Army because he's a British officer and he's fighting against the British Army, which the British Army frowns upon. So um, there's a
Frowns
big
upon is a very
question
good way
about.
to put it. I really appreciate
Yeah,
that.
um, so there's a question about whether he should be hanged as a traitor, and Howe sends for instructions to London to determine what they should really do. A couple of things help Lee. One is that Washington offered to trade a captured British officer and 4 Hessian officers in exchange for Lee. The British refused this exchange, but then when Washington finds out that they're considering hanging Lee, um, Washington says, "Whatever you do to Lee, I'm going to do to those 6 officers." So you hang Lee, those officers are going to hang. So the British right away realized that, if they don't want to see their fellow officers hanged for no good reason, they can't just hang them. Secondly, they do determine that Lee did properly resign his commission in the British Army before taking his commission in the Continental Army, so he's not a deserter. They could hang him for treason still, but they choose not to. And
I was under the
um,
impression he was still receiving half pay as a retired. Um,
no, he completely resigned his commission.
okay, interesting.
If if he had been receiving half pay, he would have hanged.
Okay,
Um,
thank you for
so
clarifying.
yeah. Um, so after that, his condition changes a bit. They allow him to get a little bit better quarters. They don't give him parole like they do a lot of officers because they do kind of consider him a flight risk and they don't want him to go back to the Americans under any circumstances. So they keep him locked up, but they give him a nice apartment. They give him a servant. They let him bring his dogs in. He was a big dog guy.
Oh,
Um,
yes, we should definitely mention that. He had like a
yeah,
handful of dogs around him all the time.
right. So his dogs join him in his confinement in Manhattan. He starts having dinner with his fellow British officers um, and just having a good old time. And this is where you alluded to earlier. He gets himself into a little bit more trouble. He decides that he is so brilliant that he could win this war for either side. And he drafts a plan of attack for General Howe to show him how General Howe could win the American Revolution for the British. So, in other words, he's giving aid and comfort to the enemy at this point.
Well,
He's
he's
committing
literally
treason
telling them
by
how to win the war. Like, we're very mad at Benedict Arnold for giving up one fort unsuccessfully.
yeah,
He attempted to give up
yeah.
the entire army. It's, I mean, from my perspective, probably the, I don't know, I don't want to call it, I don't know what to call it, but the most anti, I don't know, treasonous thing that anyone in the army did.
Well, Lee would later claim that he was trying to give bad information to General Howe. But General Howe actually follows not exactly Lee's plan, but General Lee was the one who basically suggested that he take his army to the south and invade Philadelphia from the south rather than trying to take it from the north, which is what General Howe actually ends up doing. He does a little bit differently than Lee suggested, but the general gist of the idea. And if Lee was trying to do something bad, he probably did a good job of it because that's what ended up putting the British out of position and allowing the Americans to win at Saratoga and capture Burgoyne's army.
I
Um,
guess.
I don't give Lee that much credit for having done 10 steps ahead of mental steps ahead of
Yeah.
everybody else to
And
figure
we'd
all
have
that
to
out.
determine if Lee knew that Burgoyne was coming at that point.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Um,
It's just fun.
but anyway, nobody ever knew about this other than a couple of British officers whose plans had shared this. This information never came out at the time. If it had, it would have destroyed Lee. It probably would have ended his career in the Continental Army, and if not gotten him hanged. Um, the
So
the
he
plans were discovered like 40 or 50 years after his death in among General Howe's papers. Um,
so
but yeah,
he
so
does
anyway,
get released. How long is he in custody for? About a year or so?
he a little over a year. I think it's he was captured in late 76 and right, he was released in late 77. Um, no, I guess it wasn't even that late at 77. It was they were still at Valley Forge and the British were still in so it was the summer of 1777. So yeah, I guess he was in for about 6 or 7 months.
Okay. And he's released and returns to the army and resumes his position as, now that Ward is retired at this point, number two, number one major general in the Continental Army.
Right, he is officially number two at this point. But the army he comes back to is really not the army he left, even though it's really only been 6 months. Literally, most of the army that he had left, their enlistments ended
Right.
in early 1777. So they've really recruited a whole new army. But even beyond that, um, these men were now trained by von Steuben at Valley Forge. They're a much more professional army. the militia civilian officers that had been put in command of the Continental Army a year earlier were now seasoned veterans of several campaigns. They had a lot more experience, a lot more confidence in what they were doing. So when Lee comes back with all of his bravado and how I'm so much better than all of you other idiots, it really kind of annoys a lot of the officials. And Lee almost does everything he possibly can to just piss people off. Um, when he first comes back to the army, um, General Washington offers him the guest room in his quarters at Valley Forge the first night he's back because he has nowhere else to stay. And Lee ends up smuggling in a hooker and having loud sex in the back bedroom the next day and coming to breakfast the next day half dressed and just being a complete jerk. And Martha basically demands he gets kicked out of the house.
Oh,
So
because
he'd
Martha
already
was there in Valley Forge. That's
Martha
right.
was there too.
Wow,
So
what a
yeah, it's his
guy.
fault. Yeah. So he actually takes off for about a month and goes back to Virginia, back to his farm, and hangs out for a little while. So he's not even getting reacclimated back to the army. Um, he just goes off by himself for a while, and he comes back about the time that the British are getting ready to retreat out of Philadelphia, and the Americans are trying to decide what to do about it. And Lee is still kind of the opinion that the American army is not capable of doing anything. And why would we go and confront the British army if we're just going to get our butts kicked? Why not wait? And the French are going to come bail us out real soon now because they've just declared war against Britain. And why don't we just sit back and wait for France to save our butts? That's kind of his view of things. He actually says, the British are retreating out of Philadelphia, which is what we want them to do. We want them to leave Philadelphia. We want them to go back to New York. His phrase is, "We should build them a bridge of gold." That we should just allow them to head back to New York. Whereas the other officers in the Continental Army say, "No, we're here to make every time they take a step anywhere, we want Americans shooting at them and making their lives miserable." So they realize that staying in America and occupying us militarily is not fun.
Yeah, this is a war.
So yeah, so Lee is very much against doing anything. Not all of the officers, many of the other officers want to be much more aggressive and attack. Among them is a young French general who has joined the war now, Marquis de Lafayette, um, who very much wants to go and attack the British. So Washington gives Lafayette the command to go take the advance force. Washington's going to follow with the main army. And Lafayette's going to go confront the British, who are now getting ready to retreat across Pennsylvania to New York, across New Jersey. Um, General Lee kind of realizes that maybe he is being too much left out of things. And so he steps up and says, Washington, I'm really second in command. I should get command of the advance force, not Lafayette, not this 19-year-old kid. Um, so Washington can't really refuse the second in command of the army to take this command, but at the same time, he doesn't want to annoy Lafayette, who he just gave this command to, and said, you know, and then immediately replace him before they can do anything. So Washington gives Lee command of about 1,000 men. He says, go join up with Lafayette's force. And of course, you'll take the overall command as the senior officer at that point. So Lee takes command of the advance force, and he's instructed to go confront the British and attack them, which he eventually does at Monmouth, um, which ends up being a complete mess. Not entirely Lee's fault, but um, Lee is kind of trying to confront them, and several of his generals kind of retreat without orders and just leave the battlefield, and Lee
Well,
finds
is
himself.
forgive me for interrupting, but isn't it one general sees another general do what he thinks is retreat, so he assumes there's been a retreat, so he starts retreating, and then the first general sees him retreating, and it kind of is like a domino effect of that nature?
Well, yeah, General Scott seems to think that Lee is retreating, even though Lee was advancing. And General Scott tells General Maxwell, who's the other main general in command of the center there, that everyone's retreating and we need to retreat too. So Maxwell and Scott's forces, which is the main central force of the army, retreats. Lee, sends orders to have them, move up into this other position, and the messenger comes back and goes, "Yeah, they're gone. We're alone out here." And by the way, so it's like 2,000 of us facing 6,000 regulars under
Right.
Cornwallis.
And people dying of heat
So
stroke everywhere.
yeah, and Lee is concerned because they had just come through this very narrow crevasse that's was very hard to pass through, and he realizes that if the British attack him and he has to retreat, he has to retreat through that crevasse, which is going to be almost impossible, which means his men could be captured. So he decides, all right, I got to retreat too. I got to go back and figure out what's going on, where everybody's going. The one thing he does kind of do, which is kind of a jerk move, is leaves Lafayette out there with a few hundred men, basically facing the entire British army on his own, and Lafayette has no idea what's going on. Um, but anyway, Lee's retreating. Washington comes up with the main army behind him, sees everybody retreating in disarray, and is like, "What the hell?" And he goes up and starts, asking Lee what the heck's going on. And Lee's immediate response was, "Well, I told you attacking this in the first place was a stupid idea." I mean, he doesn't use those exact words, but that's the kind of the impression he conveys, which of course Washington just explodes at this point. He's like, look, if you didn't want to fight, then don't fight. Don't take my army and then just retreat in complete disarray, you idiot.
Right.
And so he just gets into this huge screaming match at Lee, and Lee is just like,
It's not much of a match.
standing there, what the hell? uh, so yeah, so Washington ends up rallying the troops. They end up having a pretty reasonable battle, bloodying the nose of the British. But the British were retreating anyway, so that they have the battle and they continue to retreat. It's not like they considered it a loss, but the Americans said, well, we fought them and they withdrew, so therefore we win the battle, right? Um, but Washington at this point has lost all confidence in Lee. This was the man he admired. This was the man of experience who was going to win this war for them. And, he couldn't even lead a few thousand men into a simple battle. So, and Lee probably could have saved his bacon at this point if he had just been a little bit more humble and said, all right, yeah, I screwed up, or yeah, I should have done this differently, and or, this is why I did it, but
Or say, hey, why
but he
did
does
Scott
none of
order
that.
the retreat?
Right.
I didn't order
Yeah,
a retreat.
right.
He ordered a retreat. I don't know why he thinks he could order a retreat, but he's the one who did it.
There's a lot of things he could have done, but what he really does is say, he goes to Washington and he says, essentially, hey, if you want to have a battle over who's the better general, I'm going to win every time. I'm way better than you. So shut up and let me do what I want to do.
Yeah, a nice "I
Um,
told you so."
yeah. So um, Washington's had it with him at this point, and he has Lee brought up on charges for a whole bunch of things, including cowardice in front of the enemy and insubordination and not following orders and all sorts of stuff. So um, there is a court martial, but it's like several months later after the British have finally gotten back into New York and they're settled down and they have time to hold. They actually hold like about 6 really big court martials in a row that fall. Everybody from Schuyler to St. Clair and Sullivan and
Just
Lee.
all the major generals.
Yeah, cleaning house. It's like the end of The Godfather. They're
It's
just taking care of all the family business in one day.
it's crazy. They
Yeah,
literally just court martial everyone but Washington.
just about. Um, so anyway, Lee gets court-martialed. He's found guilty on all counts, and he's given a 1-year suspension, which is an extremely light sentence for the charges that he was faced. And I think I did a interview with Christian McBurney, who wrote a book on the Lee court-martial last year. Very good book, by the way, if you get a chance to read it. And his basic view of what happened was they found Lee guilty on all counts because they wanted to seem loyal to Washington, but Lee really wasn't guilty of all the charges that were made against him. They really were just punishing him for the fourth charge, which was disrespect to the commander in chief, which he was. He was
Yeah.
disrespectful to the commander
And
in
I
chief
should
on
know, if
several
people want to
levels.
learn about those the court martials, you did an episode a while back. I'm not sure. I don't remember the number. You have a few hundred. I don't know if you remember the exact number, but your episode on the court martials is absolutely fantastic because you do go through uh, all the top level ones. I don't know if you cover all of them. You cover most of them.
I covered like 3 or 4 court martials in one
Yeah,
episode. Yeah.
it's a fantastic episode. So I do recommend anyone listening to this, when you're done, if you want more American Revolution, definitely check that out. Um,
Okay.
Now Lee doesn't, Lee is not cashiered out of the army. He's just put on probation or set aside for a year. He does technically come back. I'm
Well,
not,
no, he doesn't. He doesn't really come back.
but he doesn't
He
resign yet.
he's on. Well, he's on 1 year suspension. At the end, when we're getting close to the end of that year, and he's ready to come back, someone starts a rumor that Congress is going to finally just kick him out anyway. And Lee sends this angry letter to Congress saying, "How dare you do this? I'm too good for this crap. I resign. That's it. I'm done." And then a couple days later, he realizes that they weren't going to kick him out. And he sends this other letter in saying, sorry, that other letter was a little rash. I didn't really mean it. Let's just, get on with this. Congress at that point takes the first letter and go, yeah, okay, you resigned. You're resigned now.
Yeah.
Bye.
If we weren't going to
And
kick you out then, we're certainly done with you now.
their hope was that Lee would have learned some humility from this action and that he would come back a little bit better behaved. And Lee just proved to them right then that he had learned nothing from this lesson.
Lee is I think, one of the funniest characters of the Revolutionary War. I don't love his actions, obviously, but ugh. I've been
He's an
cracking up this
interesting
whole time.
character. And if you ever get a chance to read his letters, they're just he just how I usually say officers like to kind of subtly undermine their commanders in hopes of eventually replacing them. Lee lacks all subtlety. He
Yep.
just you know during the invasion of Fort Caroline during the French and Indian War, he writes that the commander's tactics should only be done by somebody who's required to an imbecile who's required to wear a bell so that people be warned of his coming presence or something. He just really savages the guy. That's just the kind
At
of
least
guy.
he's honest. At least he's an honest person.
Um, but anyway, so yeah, Lee goes back to his farm in Virginia, and kind of falls on hard times. He actually right before he is finally kicked out, Washington returns to Philadelphia, where Lee is still trying to fight with the Continental Congress. And he actually fights a duel with John Lawrence, who's one of Washington's aides. Um,
I almost forgot about that. That is in the Broadway play Hamilton.
is it? I
Yes.
haven't seen the play.
Oh man, what do you do? Okay, well after we're done with this, I'm gonna scold you for that. Yes, that Charles Lee duels him. I will say in the play, because I believe Hamilton is Lawrence's second. In the play,
Yes.
in the play they have Aaron Burr be Charles Lee's second, which he most certainly was
No.
not. That is dramatic effect. They do take dramatic, a little bit artistic license there. Um, I'm trying to remember who Lee's second was. Not seeing it here. I'll look into it a little bit. But yeah, I understand that Lee goes on to, um, he dies kind of suddenly after this.
Right. As I said, he goes back to Virginia. He goes back to his farm. He's having some trouble, and he comes up to Philadelphia a couple years later, trying to sell some land so that he can eat. And while he's in Philadelphia, he gets terribly sick and dies very suddenly. This is like, I don't know, like 1779, I think.
Yeah, he's only like
Um,
50 years old or so.
yeah, it's a very sudden death. It's unfortunately something that happened very commonly in the 18th century. Just diseases came through, doctors sucked, there were no antibiotics, and if you got too sick, you died. and that's what happened to Lee. And right, he was buried in Christ Church. He got a little bit of respect from Congress when he died, even though that he was kind of persona non grata while he was still alive. But yeah, that was the end of General Lee.
Yeah, and I did pull it up. It was Evan Edwards is the person who is not famous at all, and why he was replaced as a character by Aaron Burr. I just pulled it up. There's a lot of Edwards I've written about before. I think he's one of the Edwards brothers. There were a handful of Edwards brothers who lived just north of Philadelphia. Yes, Evan Edwards, right. Okay. I had an article about the three brothers a while back. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah. All three of whom, I believe, no, two of whom die in the war. One doesn't. We don't have to get too into the Edwards family. That's another conversation. What we should do, now that we've essentially gotten through Mr. Lee, we got two more guys to go through. I would say the next one, because it's numerical order, would be Philip Schuyler, who has also
Yes,
himself gotten a little bit of notoriety from the Broadway play Hamilton, specifically because his daughters are featured players in the conversation.
right. Yeah, Congress appointed the first two generals on June 17th, and then they came back to the last two on June 19th. And the first one they appointed was Philip Schuyler of New York. And Schuyler always to me seemed like an affirmative action appointment. They wanted somebody from New York essentially, um,
Well, as
because they were trying to make sure New York got involved in the war. New York was not very excited about the war at this point, and so they wanted to give them a very senior officer.
right. Well, as we said, piggybacking off what you said, and as we discussed last time, New York at this point was just essentially invaded by Massachusetts when Benedict Arnold took Benedict Arnold of Connecticut was commissioned by Massachusetts, but had no soldiers. Met up with the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont, who New York thought was New York, but New Hampshire thought was New Hampshire, and they invaded New York and took Fort Ticonderoga. So,
Right.
to pacify New York, the reasonable selection was Philip Schuyler, who I believe was he a member of Continental Congress at that point?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
he
He was a
was.
delegate to the Second Continental Congress. And he was, he was a very wealthy landowner, highly respected, held lots of prominent positions in upstate New York and all that stuff. But he was really a political leader. He wasn't a military leader. I think he did serve in the French and Indian War, but he was mostly, I think, the quartermaster at the time. He didn't do a lot of combat. Um,
Similar to Artemas Ward.
right. Yeah. He was,
But for all intents and
yeah.
purposes, at that point in New York history, he was the guy. If there was someone to take charge of New York at large, especially upstate New York, he was, I would argue, pretty clearly. Uh, you would probably go with the Lord of the Manors, but they were busy being Lords of the Manors. So, as not a Lord of feudal New York, um, Philip Schuyler seems to be the right guy. He owned
Well, yeah, right. There
substantial.
were there were a couple other there were a couple other really top military leaders in New York. Unfortunately, they turned out to be loyalists because New York had a heavy loyalist population. People like Delancey and stuff like that who could, very well probably were in better positions to get these things, but they served the king.
Sure, but and in New York City certainly, but up, when you're talking about upstate, you're worried about the British coming down from Canada, like when the area of Ticonderoga and dealing with Native Americans. I will say, the gentleman, oh, his name is escaping me. Uh, um, the real guy who oversaw the Native American relations in New York with the Mohawks.
William Johnson,
I'm sorry,
Johnson, Johnson.
Johnson had just died like a year
Yeah,
and a half before this. Now,
yeah,
Sir William Johnson probably would have remained a loyalist, but it would have been interesting to see how he was there. But after William Johnson, Schuyler was one of the giants when it came to talking about Native Americans in the area, talking to Native Americans in the area, because he held such vast land and represented at many times the real landed elites of New York. He
Yeah, William Johnson's, I think his nephew, John Johnson, is the one who took over for him and took his lands and his title as Indian officer for the British.
mhm.
But you're right. Schuyler was much a highly respected person, had a lot of high level contacts. He actually spoke Mohawk. So yeah, he was
And
very
Dutch,
involved in diplomatic relations. Well, yeah, he came from a Dutch family. I think he
which
spoke Dutch better than he spoke English.
made him a good choice for New York in general, because even though it had been 100 years, New York was still heavily Dutch. I mean, the Schuyler Family Bible. Shout out to the Schuyler Mansion and Jesse Sir Philippi over in Albany. They have the family Bible, and it's in Dutch. Like,
Oh yeah, no, it was the British had taken over New Amsterdam and New Netherlands many years earlier, but the Dutch just continued to live there and live in Dutch communities and speak Dutch, and they pretty much ignored the fact that they were now English subjects. They just continued being Dutch, and then that goes for many more years after this. What's his name? Who was Andrew Jackson's vice president? Martin
oh,
Van
Martin
Buren.
Van Buren spoke Dutch. Yeah,
Martin Van Buren spoke Dutch as his first language, and we're into the mid
the
1800s by
first
then.
president born in the United States of America was also the first president not to have English as a first language.
Right, right. So yeah, Dutch was the very common language, especially when you got outside of New York City. I mean, some in New York City as well, but in upstate New York, everybody spoke Dutch, including Schuyler. Um, so yeah, he was, very integrated into all the social and economic elites of the state, which is why they chose him as a general. It wasn't for his fighting ability or military experience or anything like that. It was because he was a very popular and well established civil leader of the state.
Right. So, war starts. He's appointed general. At first, the first year there, most of the good, fun stuff is happening over in Boston, by which I mean parading around. It's happening outside Boston. But Schuyler goes to New York and takes over the Northern Army.
Right. Yeah. It becomes known as the Northern Army later after the main Continental Army moves south. But right, he's in command of all Continental forces in New York. And they actually get into a lot of action at this time too, because he's in charge of the invasion of Quebec. Uh, the Continentals are assembling forces because they want to move into Quebec and occupy it and get it to become the 14th colony that is resisting British control. Schuyler doesn't lead the attack himself. He's not a military guy. As I said, he prefers to stay behind and do recruiting and logistics and stuff like that. And so he sends Brigadier General Montgomery to lead the American forces into Quebec while he provides backup and support from New York.
Which we'll talk
Uh,
about Montgomery more in length in the next episode.
right, he becomes Major General pretty quickly after the first four. But yeah, so Schuyler is involved in the Quebec invasion and its ultimate failure. Um, and then he's basically put on defense as the British start trying to move into New York, and he eventually gets caught up with General Burgoyne's army, which comes in and captures Fort Ticonderoga and is threatening to march all the way down to New York City.
Well, before we actually,
Schuyler is,
can I just throw this
yeah,
in real
go ahead.
quick? Because Benedict Arnold, though wounded in Quebec, is the last person retreating out of Canada. And when Benedict Arnold builds his navy on Lake Champlain, he is operating under the orders of Schuyler, essentially. That seems to be his idea. But I always love this story, and we'll talk about again Horatio Gates next time, Benedict Arnold next time. But it seems that there were none of them worked very well together, but it seems Schuyler and Arnold worked pretty well together, and Horatio Gates. Um, Horatio Gates is basically given command of the Canadian Army, and he goes up to take control of it, and he goes and meets with Schuyler in New York, who tells him, "Oh, we left Canada." And so Horatio Gates has no army, which I like to call his invisible army. Just one of
Right.
those stories.
Gates becomes right. Gates thinks that he should be able to take charge of the army that has retreated out of Quebec and is in New York, whereas Schuyler says, no, they're in New York now, they're my army.
Right. And Schuyler is
So
the
that,
number 4 guy. Horatio Gates, I believe, is the first um, brigadier general to his credit, um, but does not outrank
but by
Philip
this,
Schuyler.
right, but by this time, by 1777, he's a major general as well. But right, Schuyler has seniority. He is the senior officer, and he is the overall commander in New York. So Gates and Schuyler are really butting heads and becoming, I almost want to call them enemies at this point, but certainly very much in contention with each other. And Arnold actually finds himself kind of trying to be the peacemaker between the two generals and trying to work good relationships. And he actually has pretty good relationships with both men at this point in the army. Um, and is trying to be the peacemaker in all of this. And Gates actually assists Arnold at one point. Schuyler had given command of the fleet on the lakes to some other guy, whose name I forget at the moment.
Yeah.
And Arnold is supposed to take command of the fleet, and Gates gives him command, and that Arnold and this other guy end up having this huge fight. The guy takes a shot at him with a cannon at his ship. Um, and so there's this question about who has command of the fleet on the lakes, and Gates backs up Arnold, and mostly does that because Schuyler had appointed this other guy, and Gates kind of wanted to stick it in the eye of Schuyler. So, anyways, yeah, I don't want to get too much off base
Yeah,
here. Um,
technically it's the Navy,
Sky,
so Essex Hopkins should have been in charge.
well, no, these were Army ships; they were not part of the
Oh,
Continental Navy,
fair enough.
which is a whole nother problem. But yeah, um, but anyway, so Schuyler's dealing with all this. Um, he Arnold manages to hold off the British for a year with the Battle of Valcour Island. But finally, in 1777, Burgoyne's army is coming down full steam into New York, and it's Schuyler's job to oversee the defenses that are going to keep him out of New York. And Sinclair is in charge of Fort Ticonderoga at this point, and the British come down and they realize there's just no chance of holding the fort, and they just retreat. And Schuyler supports the idea and basically agrees that what they need to do is keep pulling the British away from their lines of support and logistics and communications, and weaken them while they have time to kind of gather militia and build up their forces so that they can have a real battle. Um,
It's like we said
while
with
all
Lee,
that's happening,
retreat was usually a good option.
right?
Oh yeah, this is still before von Steuben, so still a good option.
Yes. Um, so yeah, this is still 1777. Um, but Congress has different ideas. They think that the Americans shouldn't have given up Fort Ticonderoga without a shot. They're really ticked off at Schuyler for this. And so they give command to Horatio Gates, who you'd think would be in New York, where he still has a command and fighting. But at the time that he is given command, he is in Philadelphia, bad mouthing Schuyler to all the delegates and telling him why he should get the job over Schuyler. So he races from Philadelphia up to New York to take command. And he gets there just a few weeks before the main battle at Saratoga, which of course is a great victory, mostly thanks to General Arnold ignoring his orders.
Thank you, American hero
Um,
Benedict Arnold. Yeah.
and Horatio Gates gets credit for becoming the hero of Saratoga, and Schuyler is kind of consigned to the dustbin of history. Schuyler is one of the men who gets court-martialed in that long list of court-martials that happened at the end of 1777. He's basically told that it was neglect of duty for not being at Fort Ticonderoga at the time that it was surrendered. And his defense was, I wasn't the commander of Fort Ticonderoga, so why would I be there? I was in command of the entire New York Army, and I was doing other things at the time. And the officers kind of agree, and he's acquitted.
Because
Nevertheless,
technically,
he's
Schuyler should get credit for Saratoga because he was the major general in charge of the operation.
well, he was in charge until about 2 weeks before the first Battle of Saratoga, and then
Oh,
Gates is given.
okay. I'm sorry. I have my time's mixed up there. I apologize.
In.
So he
So
should
yeah,
not get any credit.
Gates. It's like I use the analogy of Schuyler got them down to the 1 yard line, and then they handed it to Gates, and Gates carried the ball over for the touchdown, or actually handed it off to Arnold. So he
Gates
takes over
fumbled
for the
it, and
touchdown.
then Benedict Arnold picked it up and single-handedly won the game.
So yeah, Schuyler set up the whole thing, or and several other obviously,
The
but set
analogy
up
needs a little
what.
work, but it's there.
Yeah, Schuyler set everything up, and then Gates came in and wins it at the end. So, um, and Schuyler gets court-martialed and gets acquitted, and he says, "Yeah, I've had enough. I quit," and he resigns his commission.
And then he goes back
And
to private life essentially for the remainder of the war.
well, not private life. He leaves the army, but he goes back to the Continental Congress.
Yes.
He was always a politician. He was never really a military officer, and I think that's probably why he resigned. He realized that his strengths lay in political office and doing the work of in the Continental Congress. And so that's what he does. He goes back to the Continental Congress and he serves in several other governmental positions. Um, and I think he served in the New York State Senate for a while during the war.
Yeah.
And
I
then
will
after the
also,
war,
I will also note that
sorry,
in a few months before Yorktown, he's in his house in Albany, and the British attempt to kidnap him. He and his family
oh
are
yeah,
in that.
yeah,
Yeah, I don't remember the whole story. Again, they tell this story very good at the Albany Mansion. Check it out when you go to Albany. Um, but essentially they were sleeping, but one of their servants alerted them to some guys coming in the house, and they were able to like sneak out the window. I don't remember all the details, but Schuyler's able to get out, and then they kind of I believe they let some of the women and children go because they weren't really there for. That wasn't the type of kidnapping even the British were excited about. I believe there were Native Americans involved. I wish I remembered more about this story, but he does survive a kidnapping attempt just in the last few months of active hostilities.
yeah. It was a plot by a guy named John Walton Myers. I don't know a whole lot about it, but yeah, there was an attempt to kidnap
Yeah,
him. And that was very common at the time. Both sides actually kidnapped several high level people because they could use them to exchange for other high level people that were being held. So yeah, they did try to kidnap him. I think that was in 1781.
yeah. It
Yeah,
was a few months before the war, or Yorktown, not the end, but yeah,
right before Yorktown. Yeah, um, but yeah, nothing ever came of that.
yeah.
But yeah, he served in politics and became I think the first U.S. senator from New York State.
Yeah, he's an inaugural member, one of those 26 people who served in the inaugural United States Senate, which I always like to point out. Which, by the way, we said he
Right,
was much like Artemas Ward. Just like Artemas Ward resigned not that far after him, and they both serve in the first government.
right,
Well, and
and
that about sums it up. So there's one more dude that we need to talk about today.
yeah,
And
the only thing I want to mention before we leave
oh,
Schuyler is
please.
that, as you mentioned already, his daughter Elizabeth did marry Alexander Hamilton, and he lost his reelection to the U.S. Senate to a man named Senator Aaron Burr.
Right.
So
You need
you
to
see
see the
that
play, man.
he's in the he's in the middle of all that stuff going on.
Yeah, there are
But
songs
yeah,
about all of this in the play. Yeah. Yeah, it's also I should know we didn't even mention this. His other daughter Angelica marries a gentleman named John John Barker Church. I think it's Barker. John
sure,
Barker
yeah,
Church,
Barker
who
Church, yeah.
was living under an assumed name because he had been running from debts in England, somehow under a fake identity convinced the Continental Congress to let him be an auditor of the army. He goes to audit Philip Schuyler and his army, which Philip Schuyler certainly didn't care for. Um, This gentleman courts his oldest daughter, Angelica, and they elope and move to France for several years until after the war when they finally announce, oh, by the way, this is our real last name. Which I always like to point out because in the play, which again you need to see, they take some artistic licenses and just say that Angelica married a guy who was not a lot of fun, quote, and no, Barker Church was very much fun, but it's also interesting because of the Dutch heritage that New Yorkers had. We are accustomed to asking the father for a handed marriage, but his responsibility was actually to ask the mother for Angelica's hand in marriage, and Church did not do that. They eloped and ran away to France, which was not great. Um,
Yeah,
not
he actually went to Britain and became a member of Parliament for a few years too.
Yes, I forgot about that. Yes, John Barker Church, which is that's his real name. I forget his covert name. It was like Chapman or something. Uh, yes, he ends up being a member of Parliament. So one of Schuyler's daughters, one's married to Alexander Hamilton, and the other one's married to a member of Parliament. And then, as you said, he does lose to Aaron Burr, which is one of the earlier steps that lead to that oh so famous duel. It's actually also Schuyler's house is the one Hamilton got married in. We should leave Schuyler behind now, but if you have the opportunity, go to the Schuyler Mansion. They fill your head with lots of fun facts.
Yeah.
Was there anything else you wanted to cover on Schuyler before we round it out with gentleman number 4?
I don't think. I mean, his son also went on to be a member of the House of Representatives as well, Philip J. Schuyler.
Yeah,
So he started kind of a political legacy that went on well into many years.
yeah. I don't recall. I know like his other daughters also married into important families. And
Yeah, he had
his
like four, I think he had 14 kids. So
yeah,
yeah, he had a lot of different things going on. 8 of which survived to adulthood. But
yeah, and he has a bunch of really important names in his like that he's descended from too, like all the Dutch, like I don't remember which ones exactly, but if there was a Livingston in there, wouldn't be surprised. If there was like a Van Rensselaer in there, wouldn't be surprised. You know?
yeah, there were some Rensselaers and Van Cortlands, and yeah,
Yeah.
a lot of the important families in New York.
So I guess we rounded out with Old Put, Israel Putnam.
Oh, yep.
Israel Putnam, similar to some of these other gentlemen, had fought in earlier wars. I believe he fought in both the French and Indian War. Did he fight in not King Philip's War? No, that was way too. King George's War or Pontiac's Rebellion. I believe he had.
He did fight in Pontiac's Rebellion. I'm not sure he fought in King George's War or not. He was probably old enough. He was, most of the people we're talking about, including Washington, were born in the late 1720s or early 1730s. Putnam, I think, was born, was it 1718 or
18,
something?
yeah, 1718. That's what I got right here. Well played.
Yeah.
So he's one
So,
of the
yeah,
older gentlemen.
he's about 10, 15 years older than most of the other generals who are fighting this war. So he really is a lot older. But he comes from fairly common um, background. He's not really from an elite family or anything like that. He does have some military background. Um, he comes from a Massachusetts family. He ends up moving to Connecticut as a very young man because land is cheaper there, and he wants to become a farmer, and that's where he can afford land. So yeah, he moves to Connecticut, and he does get involved in the militia and does a lot of. I think he joined the French and Indian War as a private. Yeah, he joined the French and Indian War as a private, and he finished the war as a colonel.
Right.
So
On merit.
made very serious advances.
He's
Yeah,
known for several heroic events, which is why he's
right.
known around town.
He joined Rogers Rangers, which is a very famous unit during the French and Indian War, and he actually saves Colonel Robert Rogers' life at one point during the war. Um, he's present at the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga during the French and Indian War, the assault on Fort Carillon, as it's called at the time, which, by the way, I think Schuyler was there, um, General Lee was there, and Artemas Ward was there. So I think all 4 of our generals were at that battle. Um,
That's incredible. I
so
didn't put that
yeah,
together.
but yeah, Israel Putnam was at the Battle of Fort Caroline, and
That's crazy. I need to
is
like write an
fight.
article and research that. I love when people
He's
meet
fighting.
like that.
Yeah, General Putnam is fighting under a British colonel in the regulars by the name of George Howe, who is the brother of William Howe and Richard Howe. And George Howe is killed, mortally wounded in that battle, and dies in Israel Putnam's arms. So, yeah, he has a very storied career during the French and Indian War. And
That's fascinating.
yeah, and after the war ends in America, most Americans kind of go back to their lives. Israel Putnam does not. He goes to Cuba with an American regiment that is fighting with the British regulars to take Havana, and he survives a shipwreck and eventually gets back to America after the war. At which point Pontiac's rebellion breaks out, and I'm not sure if he leads the relief force, but he definitely is part of the relief force that goes to relieve Fort Detroit that is being surrounded and besieged by angry Indians. So yeah, he has a lot of experience with um, combat and warfare before the war, but he's not really what you would call a politician. He may have held some minor positions, but he was not really like a big part of Connecticut politics or anything like that. He was primarily a farmer, but he was very outspoken about British policies, and very uh, on board with the Patriot cause, and did a whole bunch of things during the coercive acts when the British closed Boston Harbor after the Boston Tea Party, and the people of Boston were suffering. They had basically no trade, no food, no income going on. He took a flock of sheep up to Boston, just personally shepherded a bunch of sheep 100 miles up to Boston and gave them to the people of Boston to eat. So, that was the kind of stuff he was doing.
Well, that's I heard that
Um,
when he finds out word of Lexington and Concord, he drops his plow, drops plow, and goes to
right.
work.
He's literally out plowing the field, gets word, literally just takes the straps off of his shoulders, leaves the horses and plows sitting in the field, jumps on a horse, rides 100 miles in 8 hours to Boston to join the fight.
and then he
Um,
and then
you know,
he essentially steps in next to Artemas Ward, and as we said, Joseph Warren to a large degree.
right. He becomes a major general from Connecticut. Um, Really kind of takes the lead in a lot of things. He's working with Joseph Warren. Really, he's one of these real firebrands that wants to really, push the British and harass them and do something and attack them. I think I mentioned last time he literally led a rifle charge out into Boston Harbor against a ship that was out there with, cannons and everything, but he,
Yeah,
he charged them with a bunch of muskets.
yeah.
The ship was stuck.
During the Battle of Chelsea Creek, yeah,
Yeah,
which I actually discussed with Spencer Van Herrick, who portrays Joseph Warren. He came on, and we actually did a whole episode just on that. So check it out in the link below
nice.
that I will forget to put
Okay.
there, but definitely check out that episode. But so yeah, there's that, and
But yeah,
then
he was just crazy. He would constantly want to, was attacking and doing all this nutso
it's
stuff.
a war. Let's go get him. For that, it seems to be his
Yeah,
attitude. Because then we get to Bunker Hill, which he also plays a humongous role in.
right. He was one of the people who was really pushing to put the occupation on Breed's Hill, which was a little bit more provocative than on Bunker Hill. It was a little bit closer to the British and actually put the Americans within range of the cannons and stuff like that. But yeah, he wanted to really provoke the British into a fight there, and he did. And um, yeah, Putnam was very involved in Bunker Hill, but he did survive it, unlike a lot of folks. And he really built his reputation during the siege of Boston.
Yeah.
And as a result, he was the only one of the first three major generals to be elected unanimously by the Continental Congress.
Which caused a bit of controversy.
Right. It's actually kind of surprising because he was not the most senior general from Connecticut. There were two generals, Joseph Spencer and David Wooster, who were more senior than than he was, and
And
he was
I'm sorry, but
given positions above.
additionally, John Thomas of Massachusetts believed he also outranked him from their prior service in the French and Indian War. So John
Yeah, well,
Thomas
yeah,
almost did not accept his brigadier, and we'll talk about Thomas next week. But he almost did not accept his position of brigadier general, just like Wooster and Spencer, because of
right.
Old Put.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the two from Connecticut. There were quite a few generals from Massachusetts who felt they were being screwed over, and a couple from New Hampshire
Yeah,
and all that.
but it's
There were
interesting.
a
You
lot of
were
hard
saying,
feelings.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say there were a lot of hard feelings about who got promoted and who didn't.
Right. Well, I was going to say earlier in the conversation when we are talking about Lee, you had mentioned that there really wasn't any, there were not any Americans who had a lot of experience leading men, but it certainly feels like if anyone did, it would have been Israel Putnam between prior wars in New England and Cuba and the Northwest. He certainly seems like he had a lot of experience.
Putnam had a lot of combat experience, but he was not necessarily the leader of regiments or groups larger than a regiment during any of those wars. He was dealing with relatively small groups of commands before the American Revolution.
Sure, but
So he
those
was a leader, but not a general.
yeah, but those commands had been getting bigger and bigger and bigger throughout his career. Just seems like if there was a guy, it would have been Putt.
Right. As I said, he didn't have the experience of a general officer, but he had a lot of the leadership qualities that they were looking for. And they saw that he was a good leader of men, that he was very impressive at the Siege of Boston. And as I said, he had a very storied experience during the French and Indian War. So, yeah, he had a lot of very good combat qualifications. Now, would the British have selected him as a general? Almost certainly not, because they had so much of a deeper bench to choose from. The Americans, not so much. He looked very good from their position.
And unfortunately, all of the criticisms seem to pan out. Um, he joins the army, sieges Boston, and after the British leave, he joins the army in their trip to New York, where he does participate in the failed attempt to defend New York from a massive invasion.
Yeah, he gets a bad rap there. I mean, he literally took over Long Island 2 days before the British invaded. So it's not like he had a lot of time to set up defenses and see what was going on and figure all that out. You got to blame Nathaniel Greene for that. He was the one who really set everything up on Long Island. And
Right. And he makes up
um,
for it.
no, yeah, he definitely does a
Nathaniel
lot
Green
better
comes
things.
around in this story.
Yeah, but early in the war, Nathaniel Greene was not so great. But So anyway, yeah, Putnam gets put in command, as I said, just 2 days before the attack. Um, they obviously get overwhelmed. They get flanked. Putnam stands up, fights bravely, but obviously has to retreat, and he gets blamed by Congress for the loss of Long Island. And Washington doesn't blame him, but Congress does.
Right. And then he never loses his command, but he is, in a fashion the same way that Ward was, kind of brushed aside and given more menial tasks for, is it a year or two, until unfortunately he has a stroke, which is
Yeah,
essentially the end.
Washington. Yeah, Washington never really brought him into his family, so to speak. He did kind of put Putnam out on his own. Putnam spent a lot of time in New England on recruiting missions because that's something he was good at. Washington gave him command of the Hudson Valley, and when Henry Clinton sailed up the Hudson to during the Burgoyne thing, um, um, he,
You
he
mean the
basically,
Saratoga campaign? Did you just reference the
yeah,
Saratoga campaign as that
the
Bourgogne
Burgoyne
thing?
thing. During while the Saratoga campaign was going on, um, Clinton moved up the Hudson River and basically took Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery by basically misleading Putnam, and Putnam thought he was going to attack somewhere else, and he moved all his troops over there. And then Clinton took the forts and made Putnam look like an idiot. So Putnam got a lot of blame for that as well. But in the end, they realized he probably couldn't have held it anyway because they'd basically taken all of his soldiers because, most of the soldiers were either up fighting against Burgoyne in upstate New York or down in Philadelphia fighting the Philadelphia campaign. So Putnam had almost no men at the time anyway. But anyway, he gets kind of a blame for that. And yeah, they leave him in kind of unimportant positions in New England and New York. And then he has a stroke at the end of 1779, which pretty much ends his civil or military career.
Right. He kind of retires to his arm for the next decade or so until he passes away.
Yeah, he lives for another 10 years, but he never fully recovers from his stroke. So he's basically just living at home and, sadly.
Well, you're a nerd for the American Revolution when you can't stop laughing when someone refers to the Battle of the Saratoga campaign as that Burgoyne thing. Which I want to start calling it now, but there might be people watching for the first time who don't know what I'm doing.
That Burgoyne thing.
That's amazing. So, Michael, we've covered top four guys after Washington in the Continental Army. Is there anything you think we might have missed with any of the gentlemen, or any summation? We did a pretty thorough job.
Not that I can think of. I mean, these were the starters. I would say that, you saw that the Continental Congress was trying to spread them out from different states. We have, one from Massachusetts, one from Connecticut, one from New York, one from Virginia. So they are trying to spread them out. You see the New England being very heavily represented because almost all the soldiers at this time were from New England. There were only a handful of rifle companies from Virginia and Pennsylvania that came up and joined the New England Army at this time. So there really wasn't a whole lot else. And you'll see when other states really or colonies get more involved in the war, when it moves to New York, you're going to see a lot of other generals from a lot of other places being promoted.
Yeah, well, we did discuss that a little bit in the video where we ran through them real quick, and we will do it at length. We're going to be doing them in chunks, just like we did today with the top four. I'm sure it won't be four every time. We got 27 of them to get through, and especially when we get a little bit later in the war, it's a little bit easier to cruise through because they didn't serve as long or weren't necessarily as important to their states at the outset. Like these gentlemen are big names in colonial fill in the blank. New England, New York, blah blah blah. So yeah, we've covered them. I thank you so much for coming back and really helping me through this. This is tough even as a two-man job.
Yeah, it's a lot to get through.
Yeah, and I do want to tell. I forget the number of the episode. I'll look it up and put it in the link before I send this out. But I definitely recommend everyone listen to your episode about the court martials because it adds a lot of it's a nice conclusion to the conversation we just had because so many of the men we're talking about today, 50% of them do end up getting court-martialed, and the other two get brushed aside by Washington pretty early in the war. So we've started to see some themes developing in our major generals. Michael, thank you.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
I just looked it up. It's episode 195. It's the court martials episode.
195 at the American Revolution podcast. Go over there, guys. Definitely check that out. I'll put a link in the description just to make things easy. And I'll make a note as soon as we're done here so that it's easy for me to find. Thank you again, Michael. You are the best. I look forward to you coming back probably next week, I would assume, for more major generals and generally speaking.
Sounds good.